today's episode, I'm talking with Jeff Asher, Crime Analyst. I guess like what are you doing? Like Crime Analyst? How did you get into that? That's
I was in DC for 7 years after undergrad. I got my master's, moved back home, and I had experience in thinking and writing and analyzing, and so I managed to score a job with the police department as their first crime analyst.
Okay.
And I did that.
NOPD.
Yeah, NOPD. I did that for 2 years and decided it was time to do my own thing and start my own business. And I still only had this one skill. So the city produces this incredible volume of open data, and I had worked for large bureaucracies as sort of this unknown cog, and so I started doing this public-facing gear. It was a business decision.
Yeah.
I needed to have some sort of public resume out there, and so I started to tweet and write and do some freelance work. And
because you've been in Gambit. You were on WWL's Crime Analyst. I just saw you
The Advocate, for
2 days ago, an Advocate. You were just there. You were just quoted an Advocate.
Yeah, and it sort of morphed as the sort of launching the business part has settled down. It sort of morphed into more of a keeping tabs on things, public service type of messaging system. But it really started as just a way to get my name out there, and it certainly morphed into much more than that. Your
data and all. The stuff that you talk about is super interesting. So you do have a website, nolacrimenews.com, which is where you have like all of the stats and stuff like that. But I'm going to tell you, so I went to NOLA Crime News, and I'm looking at this, and it's overwhelmingly like, you got charts and graphs, and like, it's just like for me, and I'm dumb, like. So this is pretty much, and I'll draw out.
All right, please do.
This is his website. You got your chart. It looks, you've got all your charts that look, the line graphs kind of look like this. And so this is, every one of them, they do this, and then it's like this. So this is what all of your charts look like. This is it.
Well,
they all look like that.
That's my shooting chart. I can tell from the.
Yeah,
it's been a rough couple of months.
It's been real bad. It's been real bad.
It really started about a year ago, and I have a couple of months ago, I did just a where are we now look, and you can kind of break down, for now just diving into the analysis.
Yes.
You can kind of break down gun violence here specifically, shootings in terms of a couple of different trends. You had 2010 to 2012, we were kind of at this level, and then NOLA for Life gets launched, and you kind of have this dip, and the dip lasts about 6 to 8 months at this much lower level. And then 2014, things start to rise, but they rise to kind of this level. And they're here from 2014 to mid-2016, and then last summer hits, and things just kind of take off. And so we're at...
So what's NOLA for Life, real quick? You said that, so that seemed like that was working. It's like, okay, what is that?
So NOLA for Life was the city's anti-gun violence, anti-gang initiative that was launched in 2012. It really took hold in 2013.
Okay.
The main parts of it, in terms of anti-gun violence, was indicting gang members. So they indicted over 100 gang members on federal and state charges. So these are basically, you're being indicted, you're probably going away for a very long time.
Okay.
And they did it under these racketeering statutes. So if you and I are in a criminal organization together, and I murdered someone, and you're also in the criminal organization, they can get you on really serious charges without getting you on that murder charge, is what the racketeering indictment did. So it really led to breakups of 9, 10 really intense gangs in the city. The other thing the city did was these call-ins, where basically they sent letters and worked with people that were on probation and parole, brought them into the courthouse, and basically read them the riot act and also offered them services. So it was this intense anti-gang focused program that was a messaging program that once you sort of get the message out there, and once you get all the gang members that you can initially get, because these indictments are really hard to do. They take a lot of effort, they take a long time, and so once they had done them, it just sort of ran out of momentum.
Okay.
And so as 2014 and 2015 came on, the last gang indictment was in 2015,
Okay.
Almost all of them happened between late 2012 and mid 2014.
So it's like we tried that, we did it, and
Yeah. And
so is there? How do we? Can we?
so the programmatic effects likely wore off, and now you're seeing some of at least my assessment is that you're seeing a city that isn't really doing what it was doing in 2012, 2013 that led to success, and you've also got a department that's down 30% of its manpower.
Which is my next thing. So yeah, I keep reading that. The officers are down, and we don't have cops. Well, why did we, number one, how did that happen? How did we let that happen, and how do we correct it? I mean, what happened? Why did we not get cops? Who thought that was a good idea?
I don't think anyone thought it was a good idea necessarily. I think that it was a decision that was made by this administration, 2010, 2011, 2012 really, that they didn't think that the city was on stable enough financial footing to really do recruiting like they're doing it now.
Okay.
And so it was a relatively easy way to avoid several $1 million bill, avoid growing NOPD. And they did it at a time when nationally lots of cities across the country dealing with the recession dealt with this. Something like 3/4 of big cities lost 5 to 10% at least of their officers over the recession. And they happened to do it at a time when it's become increasingly difficult to grow police departments. So really it was a couple of years, it was 3 years essentially, of lowered recruiting or non-essential or lowered recruiting, plus slightly above average attrition. So NOPD averages about 8.5% attrition. Over those 3 years,
so
they average
eight officers are gone off the top no matter what.
Yeah,
Roughly
8 of every 100.
8 of every 100.
So you're looking at losing on average about 100 officers, 120 officers
a year. And then if you're not replacing that,
exactly,
you start to.
And those 3 years just happened to correspond with slightly above average, so they lost a little bit more than average officers over that time frame. And so by the time they started to recruit again, they were down 400 essentially.
So how long is it going to take us to catch back up?
I don't know how many years you got left.
It's
very difficult. At the current rate, you're looking at 10, 15, 20 years.
So we got 20 years until we can get the amount of.
Well, unless you find a way to dramatically increase recruiting. And so I think that that's really an issue. It should be an issue for this mayor's race. It should be an issue for all of us. It's not that they're not trying. It's not that they're not dedicating the resources. It's that at this point in time, it's really, really hard to recruit police officers. So if something like 2.5 or 3% of all applicants become officers.
Wow.
So you're looking at needing something like, to replace 400 officers, you're looking at needing something like 50,000 applicants over at this rate.
Why is that?
Well, you have background checks, you have polygraphs, you have criminal checks, it's a very difficult job.
Yeah.
It's 6 months of
I wouldn't want that job. I'd give,
it's very difficult. It's not
police
necessarily
officers
for
get
everyone.
half off their coffee here and everything. I respect the job, and I would not want that job. So I can see why. I guess you got to find 400 people to do the job. It's
a very honorable profession. You can make a good living being a police officer. But it can also be difficult. It's just from a work environment.
Yeah.
Dangerous.
Work environment, I think, would be the number one thing with NOPD officers, huh?
And NOPD pay is competitive with the region, but if you've got the choice and you've got the choice between working here and in an outside parish where maybe the crime is lower, the cost of living is lower, so
it's easier to.
It may be the type of thing that you have to overpay.
Because do they still have the thing where you have to live in Orleans Parish?
No, there's no residency requirement.
No residency requirement.
There's no education requirement. So they're relaxing standards a little bit, which can be a challenge. If you look back through the history of NOPD, whenever we've relaxed standards, we've had then a couple of years, and then you've had scandal.
Yeah.
So it can be a challenge going forward of how do you get the right
quality officers. We need 400 quality officers.
Yeah, and it's
hard.
hard.
It's hard. That's not something that's simple.
It's hard, and I think that. And I was writing this last January when the city was coming out with its proposals that you're not going to grow by 50 a year. You're not going to grow by 30 a year right off the bat. It's going to be very difficult to achieve those big growth numbers, and the city was sort of projecting these big growth numbers, and you just look across the country, no one's doing it. So it's not because New Orleans is failing, it's just really hard to do, and no one's succeeding at this point.
So you're talking about, trying to get the amount of like crime down. So there's been investments in technology. So let's briefly, I guess, talk about that. Cameras and things like that NOPD has been putting in around the city. Mitchell Andrew had the thing with Bourbon Street and all that kind of stuff, closing the doors. That whole plan. I can't believe anybody got paid for that idea. Like that's like a secondary idea. Let's close the bars. I guess I don't know. But the investments in cameras and video technology, is that helping? Is that and if you've got all these cameras around, who's monitoring those cameras?
Well, that's the real issue. Is that we just talked about the manpower problem.
Right.
You go straight into the camera problem. The research shows that if you want to be effective, cameras can be effective against certain types of crime. Usually it's car burglary, car theft, but only if you have the ability to do live monitoring at large scale, and you've got the ability to have patrol that is connected to the live monitoring. So, you're assigned to sit at a camera or at a desk, you see something happening, you have a patrol that's not responding to emergencies, it's not responding to burglar alarms, it's not responding to cats and trees.
And burglar alarms, you hate them. I've read that. You hate burglar alarms.
Absolutely.
Burglar alarms suck up a massive amount of time.
Terrible time waste. Absolutely.
Okay, yes.
But you've got so if you have the officers that are able to then respond to whatever suspicious the person sees.
You're being proactive.
Yeah, and so you have to have enough cameras. The city's large. The number of cameras, the city, I think, the $40 million crime plan talked about 250 or so cameras, and we're talking about several thousand, tens of thousands of city blocks.
Yeah.
So the likelihood of catching a crime live on camera,
and someone seeing it,
and then having the manpower to respond.
We're kind of just.
And if you don't have the ability to respond, then the criminals eventually realize that the cameras are just fancy devices that.
They can do a crime right in front of it. Who cares? Nobody's going to see me anyway.
Exactly.
Right.
And so it's very difficult to rely on cameras. I think cameras are great.
Yeah.
I believe in the technology. I believe in the ability of technology to improve crime fighting. But that's kind of the lagniappe.
It's a pie in the sky kind of thing.
Yeah,
it's a little bit.
It can be the icing on the cake. It's not the cake itself.
One of the things that you talked about too is that 90% of murders. This is one of your stats here. This is just of all murders are rooted in the drug trade. So what?
Well, wait.
Is that not right? Did I not get that right?
Not exactly. 90% of is either.
This is the drug trade murders.
Yeah, you got to turn it upside down.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
It's either narcotics, robbery, argument, or retribution.
Okay.
I think those are the four. So basically, those are the motives. Of the known motives, I studied NOPD's homicide spreadsheets from 2008 to 2014, and it showed that basically 90% of motive was one of those motives.
Was drugs.
And so, but you think the narcotics trade fuels argument, it fuels retribution.
You can't call the
police.
You
have drug robberies.
Yeah.
So it's hard to sort of draw that exact line. At least a quarter of murders are drug related, probably a higher percentage. But if you and I get into a fight about drugs and NOPD writes down that it was an argument, then that wouldn't necessarily show in those numbers. So it's really hard. They also
to pinpoint that,
yeah, and the majority of murders, NOPD does not necessarily see a motive. I mean, they're solving this year. They're solving close to 25%.
So, because you said that you said that okay, so if we go after the drug problem, we can go after a majority of the crime problem or shootings and stuff like that. How do you deal? I guess the question is, how do you deal with it? We've already got one of the highest incarceration rates. So it's we're locking people up, but we still had this high crime rate. So how do you?
That's the challenge. And I think that, I talked about drug enforcement. There was a 60% drop in narcotics, Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drug enforcement between 2012 and 2016 because of the manpower issues. And so with that drop in drug enforcement, there was a strong correlation in the rise in drug overdose deaths. kind of logically, you think if you've got less enforcement, you could conceivably have a more active drug market, lead to more gun violence. If you've got more, just like if you've got more robberies, and robberies make up 10% of your murder motives, then you're going to have more robbery-related murders. So the question is, how do you handle that? Because I'm strongly against mass incarceration. I'm strongly against mass arrests. I think that the city needs to think about investing serious resources in, if you're able to pick up your drug enforcement, what can we do that's not jail?
Yeah.
What diversion programs? What pre-arrest diversion, post-arrest diversion? What resources can we really
Because one of the things that I thought that you were really talking about, like, the human loss, of course, is huge, but when you talk about just the city from a business, from a numbers standpoint, the cost of crime, money-wise, was staggering. That was another one of your articles.
Yeah, I mean, there's some research out there that you're looking at $8 to $10 million per murder.
$8 to $10 million per murder.
You think
so
about.
So let's say $8 million per murder. We've had how many murders up until right now?
95.
95. Yeah, so
that's a lot of money.
That's a lot. So I mean, that's an insane amount of money that if we could direct that money towards, not killing.
And that's the cost to society. That's it's the cost of the medical costs of trying to save that person's life, the cost of investigating, the cost of prosecuting, the cost of jailing, the loss of income that person was going to generate. If you catch the person, the loss of income that person was going to generate for them and their family.
Yeah.
So it's not,
It's not just to the city.
Nobody gets an $8 billion bill,
yeah.
But it's societally, this cost is remarkable.
It's remarkable.
And so I think that, kind of getting back to the drug enforcement and this, I think that you can kind of, and it's easy for me from a data perspective to sort of draw this assessment of, if we were to explain why gun violence is out of control at this point, there does appear to be some connection here. It's much harder to figure out how to put our resources in and how to devote all of the money that the city's bringing into solutions that don't involve, tough on crime, arresting everybody.
Yeah.
Because even if you acknowledge, okay, it's an $8 million price tag per murder victim, so we should be spending hundreds of millions of dollars specifically on murder reduction. How do you do it? And that's the question.
What is that? Yeah, what is the way to solve that? Like, what
I don't know.
is
I'd be in my golden palace if I knew the answer to that. It's very difficult, and I think that a large part of the solution is there's all this research out there that shows how concentrated gun violence is. Every year since 1987, between 75 and 85% of our murder victims have been black men. A black man in his 20s had a murder rate last year of 300 per 100,000, so that's about 62 times the national average. And it's not just by race and age, it's even more concentrated. Chicago, for example, they have developed this algorithm that, and I have lots of issues with the way the algorithm is being used, but it shows that a very tiny percentage, about 1,400 people, are present at something like 20% of their murders, and that's like 0.67%, I think, of the city's population, or even, that's even smaller. That's like under 1/10% of Chicago's population.
You talking about the Yale study? Is that from?
Yeah, Andy Papachristos.
Yes,
did
I'm
that.
glad you said that, because I really kind of dug into that a little bit, because I was really interested in it. Yes, so he was getting it down to like between 75 to 95% or something like that of knowing who future murder victims were personally.
And when I was with the city, I did similar research that found a very high percentage, up to half of our murders are conducted by under 1% of the city, or under 1% of our murders, under 1% of the city population was present. And so if you can identify a very tiny percent, you're talking 3,000 to 4,000 people. The problem is the way Chicago has approached this. Chicago has developed this algorithm, and they've decided that these are potential perpetrators, and they've handed it to the police department, and the police department largely uses these things for arrests, They do these things called custom notifications where they send police officers out there and they basically read them the riot act and also say, here's some social services. It's kind of this, if you see everything as, if all you've got is a hammer, you see everything as a nail. If you look at these people that you identify as being at substantially higher risk than everyone else in the city, if you look at them as potential perpetrators, we need to get the police department involved.
Right.
If you think about approaching these people as potential victims of gun violence, it's a whole different set of interventions. And so I think that the solution is in developing interventions. If I know that you are at 700 or 800 times the likelihood to get involved in gun violence as your average citizen, and I know that things like you don't have a job, you're, you may have had PTSD or mental health issues, you may not have gotten a great education pre-Katrina here, you may have drug addiction, things like that. If I specifically highlight you and say, I'm going to create jobs, I'm going to spend resources to create a job specifically for you. I'm going to dedicate mental health resources, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to find you, I'm going to bring you in, and I'm going to dedicate mental health resources to you. I'm going to focus group you. I'm going to bring you into City Hall, and I'm not going to read you the riot act. I'm going to say, what can I do to help? What can the city do specifically to make your situation easier?
That sounds great. That sounds like that is the solution.
It's the solution, but it's expensive. You're looking at 7, 8, 9 figures potentially over several years. But if you're losing, if we're at the societal cost is $800 million for the city this year in terms of murder. So far in the first 6 months.
This even sounds better than, because sometimes when people talk about crime, it's like, oh, we need education. And of course, yes, we need education. We need education for a lot of reasons, but crime specifically, what you're talking about, trying to help, and it's almost like there's a moral, so what you're saying is that we can pull the numbers or whatever and target about 400 people, 4,000 people in town that are 800 times more likely to be involved in some type of gun violence, whether on the perpetrating end or on the victim end, doesn't matter. And those are the people. So it seems like we have like a heightened moral responsibility. Like we know who these people are. We need to find a way to help these people out.
Absolutely. And this research is relatively new. I think that the cities, mainly Chicago, that have tried to use it have done it poorly.
Did a bad job with it?
It gives it a bad name, and I think we need to embrace the fact that we know gun violence is concentrated and that we can develop means of stopping that. I think the answer for me is that we need to invent it. The city of New Orleans can be the first city that invents solutions based on these concepts because no city is inventing it. We can experiment. I think it would be a great thing to be more jobs like yours in town. Yeah. It would be great.
Yeah. That's actually a great, it's a great idea. It would be something that we could lead the nation with.
It's not easy, and it's not inherently, this great PR of building school playgrounds and things like that. But if you look at sort of
saving lives is huge. Saving lives is a big deal.
Yeah, and it is a big deal, but it's hard. You're going to fail.
Thank you for the vote of confidence.
Yeah, well, not you, the royal you. It's very challenging, and I think that but it's sort of our moral imperative to find that solution. I'm certainly open to other ideas if there are them, but I think that as far as the place to start, if you can either dedicate your limited resources to everyone in the city equally, or you can narrow your limited resources on the specific people that are at high risk. And that's what NOLA for Life tried to do, but it was very much, the focus was very much on the enforcement end and not so much on the deterrent end. Yeah. And I think that...
deterrent end is where it's at.
Deterrent might not even be a bad word. It might be better to call it the intervention end. And that's the end that I think is going to eventually build results. So,
Jeff, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
You've definitely you helped explain this and what we can do to maybe do that with it.
Yeah,
so
ideally.
that would be wonderful. Jeff, thank you so much, man.
Thanks
I appreciate it. Take care.
Me.